On May 14, 1918, a quiet stretch of the Western Front in France settled into darkness, the kind of silence that never meant safety and always hinted at movement just beyond sight. This video is about what happened that night when a single American soldier stopped a German trench raid that should have succeeded and did it alone. Along a forward listening post pushed out ahead of the main trench, 2 American soldiers stood watch under French command, exposed by design and separated from help by open ground and darkness. The position existed for one reason only, which meant detecting enemy movement early enough to warn the line behind them, even if that warning came at the cost of their own lives. One of those men was Henry Johnson. The night offered little light and no comfort, and the ground in front of the post began to shift in a way every frontline soldier recognized instantly. German stormtroops were moving forward in silence, advancing through no man's land as part of a trench raid designed to kill quickly, seize prisoners, and disappear before defenders could respond. Johnson saw them first, and that changed everything. Instead of waiting, instead of freezing, instead of hoping the darkness might protect him, Johnson hurled a grenade toward the approaching figures and shouted a warning back toward the trench. The explosion shattered the quiet, which meant surprise was gone and the raid had already begun to unravel. German soldiers surged forward anyway, closing the distance with practiced speed, and within seconds the listening post was under direct attack from multiple directions. Johnson's partner went down almost immediately, badly wounded and unable to move, leaving Johnson standing alone in a position never meant to be defended by one man. Rifle fire erupted at close range, and Johnson fired back without hesitation, aiming in the dark at shapes that moved too fast and too close for comfort. The exchange collapsed into chaos as the raiders tried to overwhelm the post before reinforcements could arrive, which was how these attacks were meant to end. That changed when Johnson refused to give ground. As German soldiers pressed in, he kept firing until his rifle ran dry, and when the weapon jammed, he did not stop fighting or step back. The result was something the raiders did not expect: a wounded sentry who stayed upright and aggressive instead of surrendering or collapsing under pressure. What followed was brutal and immediate, with Johnson striking back at attackers who tried to rush the position, using whatever he could reach to keep them from taking his wounded comrade. The fight dragged on far longer than any trench raid was supposed to last, and that delay mattered more than numbers or noise. German discipline began to break in the darkness because hesitation spread faster than orders, and the longer the resistance continued, the more dangerous the situation became for the attackers themselves. What nobody expected was that the raid would fail completely, not because of counterattack or artillery, but because one man would not yield. When the Germans finally pulled back, slipping away into the same darkness they had used to approach, the ground in front of the listening post was littered with bodies and abandoned equipment. Johnson was still standing, wounded heavily, exhausted and barely able to move, but the line had held. The silence returned, heavier than before. By morning, the meaning of that night was already clear to those who understood trench warfare. A listening post had survived a direct raid, a wounded soldier had protected his comrade, and an attack designed to spread fear had collapsed instead under resistance no doctrine accounted for. What happened next would take decades to correct because recognition did not follow immediately, and the country Johnson served would not honour him the way others did. But on May 14, 1918, none of that mattered because the raid had failed, the warning had been given, and the line had not broken. Henry Johnson's war did not begin in a trench or under artillery fire. It began years earlier in a country that demanded his labour while denying him status. Born in 1892 in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, his early life unfolded under the rigid boundaries of the Jim Crow South, where opportunity was narrow and expectation even narrower. Like many black Americans of his generation, Johnson moved north while still young, which meant Harlem became the place where his adult life took shape. Work came in hard forms, long hours, physical labour and little security, but Harlem also offered something the South did not: a sense of community and a measure of independence, even if equality remained distant. Military service entered his life in 1917 when the United States joined the First World War and began mobilizing on a massive scale. Johnson did not enter the army as a political statement or a calculated bid for recognition, because for many men like him, enlistment was simply another obligation imposed by the country they lived in. Once in uniform, he was assigned to the 369th Infantry Regiment, a unit that would earn its reputation not through publicity, but through endurance. The regiment was composed primarily of black soldiers trained under white officers and viewed with suspicion by much of the American military establishment before they ever reached Europe. Training was strict and often unequal, and equipment arrived slowly if it arrived at all. White units frequently refused to drill alongside them, which meant the 369th trained in isolation under constant pressure to prove competence in an institution that assumed failure. That tension followed them across the Atlantic. When American forces arrived in France, the US Army made a decision that defined the regiment's wartime experience. Rather than integrate the 369th into American divisions, command transferred them to French control, a move driven less by strategy than by unwillingness to confront segregation within its own ranks. The result was unusual and immediate. Johnson and his fellow soldiers fought under French officers, wore French helmets, carried French rifles, and operated according to French doctrine while still wearing American uniforms. The arrangement placed them in active combat sooner and more consistently than many US units because the French needed reliable infantry and were willing to use them. Combat came quickly and did not let up. French commanders assigned the regiment to exposed sectors of the line, areas where discipline mattered more than numbers and where listening posts and patrols absorbed the first contact with the enemy. Over time, the unit earned respect the hard way by holding ground and returning fire when others might have broken. Johnson's role inside the regiment was unremarkable on paper. He served as a private, performed routine duties, and rotated through the same dangerous assignments as everyone else. Listening post duty, like the position he held on May 14th, carried no prestige and no margin for error because it placed men ahead of the trench with limited protection and no immediate support. The purpose of those posts was narrow and unforgiving. Two soldiers watched the dark, listened for movement, and sent warnings if the enemy approached, which meant survival depended on seconds rather than strength. If a raid hit fast enough, the men stationed there were expected to be killed or captured before help could arrive. Johnson understood this reality well. By the spring of 1918, trench warfare was no longer theoretical, it was routine, and German raiding tactics were familiar to anyone who had spent time on the line. Silence at night did not mean peace, it meant preparation, and every listening post existed with the knowledge that it might be the next target. That knowledge shaped Johnson's behaviour long before the raid began. He was not positioned there to fight a prolonged battle, and he was not expected to stop an attack on his own. His job was to detect movement, send the warning, and hold as long as possible, even if that hold lasted only moments. Everything else depended on what happened next. The difference, and this is where his story turns, was that Johnson did not view retreat or surrender as acceptable outcomes once contact was made. A lifetime of labour, pressure, and constrained choices had already taught him what happened when control was surrendered to someone else. When the ground in front of the post began to move that night, he did not interpret it abstractly. He understood exactly what was coming, what it meant for his wounded partner, and what would happen to the line behind them if the raid succeeded. The decision to act did not arrive slowly. It came as instinct, sharpened by training and circumstance, and it carried him straight into the kind of fight no doctrine prepared anyone for. The grenade he threw was not an act of heroism, it was a refusal to let the raid unfold as planned. French officers would later understand that distinction immediately because they had spent years watching raids succeed for lack of resistance. American command, constrained by its own structure and biases, would take far longer to catch up. But in that moment, none of that mattered. Johnson stood in the listening post because that was where he had been placed, and when the night closed in, he stayed standing because he saw no other option that preserved control. That choice, made in seconds, set the conditions for everything that followed. By 1918, trench raiding had become one of the German army's most reliable tools on the Western Front, not because it was dramatic, but because it worked. These were not large assaults meant to seize ground or hold territory. Raids were small, deliberate operations built around speed, surprise, and intimidation, designed to extract information and leave the enemy shaken. German planners treated raids as controlled events. Units selected narrow targets, rehearsed movement routes, and timed their advances to exploit darkness, rain, or low visibility. Soldiers crossed no man's land quietly, carrying grenades, pistols, knives, and wire cutters because rifles were secondary once distance collapsed. The objective was simple: strike fast, create confusion, seize prisoners, and withdraw before defenders could respond in force. Listening posts sat at the centre of this doctrine. These forward positions existed to hear and see what the main trench could not, which meant they were isolated by design. Usually manned by 2 soldiers, sometimes 3, they offered limited cover and no immediate support. German commanders understood that if a listening post fell quickly, the alarm died with it, and the raid could roll straight into the trench line behind. Most raids succeeded at that stage. Even when defenders detected movement, shock usually carried the day. Grenades went in first, followed by aggressive movement, and shouting meant to exaggerate the size of the attacking force. Panic spread faster than information, and hesitation brought the raiders exactly what they needed: prisoners and time. Withdrawal was the final phase. Raids were never meant to linger. The longer attackers stayed in place, the more likely they were to face artillery, counterattacks, or coordinated rifle fire. Once objectives were achieved, German troops slipped back into darkness, leaving behind dead sentries and shaken units. This pattern had repeated itself across the front for years. On the night of May 14, 1918, the raiding party advancing toward Henry Johnson's listening post expected that same sequence to unfold. Surprise would open the door, shock would finish the job, and withdrawal would follow before the defenders could recover. That expectation shaped every move they made. What changed the outcome was not superior firepower or reinforcement, but disruption. When Johnson threw his grenade and shouted the warning, the raid lost its most important advantage immediately. Surprise vanished, and with it the clean opening German doctrine relied on. Most raids could recover from early detection. Speed and aggression usually compensated for lost surprise because defenders often froze once contact was made. What the raiders encountered instead was resistance that did not slow down or break apart under pressure. Johnson stayed active. That mattered more than numbers. Every second the listening post remained contested increased the risk to the attackers. The longer the fight lasted, the more likely it became that the main trench would wake fully, that supporting units would prepare to respond, and that the raid would turn from opportunity into liability. And that is where doctrine began to fail. German raiders were trained to overwhelm passive resistance, not to manage prolonged close quarters fighting against a defender who refused to disengage. As the fight dragged on, coordination dissolved, movement slowed. Individual soldiers hesitated, unsure how many Americans opposed them or how close help might be. Darkness magnified uncertainty. Shadows obscured numbers, sound distorted distance, and Johnson's continued aggression suggested escalation that did not yet exist. The raid no longer felt controlled, it felt exposed. That shift carried consequences. Grenades meant for the trench line were thrown defensively. Movement routes meant for withdrawal became clogged. Time, the one resource raiders could not afford to lose, slipped away second by second. This is the point where successful raids usually ended or died. On that night, the German raiders chose survival. Withdrawal came not because objectives were met, but because staying meant risking destruction. The attack pulled back, abandoning its purpose entirely, leaving behind casualties and a listening post that should have fallen within moments. From a doctrinal perspective, this outcome was rare. A listening post had not only survived a raid, it had broken the raid's logic. No prisoners were taken, no intelligence was gained. The warning had been sent. The line remained intact. French officers understood exactly what that meant. They had spent years studying German methods, watching raids succeed because defenders behaved as expected. Johnson's resistance shattered those expectations and in doing so exposed how fragile even refined systems could be when predictability collapsed. What happened that night was not chaos overpowering order. It was one man denying the enemy the sequence they depended on. By refusing to freeze, retreat or surrender, Johnson forced the raid into unfamiliar ground where training offered fewer answers and hesitation carried greater risk. Doctrine did not account for that kind of resistance, and without doctrine to lean on, the attack unravelled. That failure echoed beyond the darkness of no man's land. A method that had worked repeatedly had been stopped cold, not by counterattack or overwhelming fire, but by persistence that disrupted every stage of the plan. And that is why the night mattered. Not because it produced headlines or immediate recognition, but because it revealed a simple truth about war in 1918. Systems function until someone refuses to behave as expected. On May 14, 1918, that refusal changed the outcome. The moment the German raiders committed fully to the attack, the fight stopped resembling anything planned and collapsed into something raw and immediate. Distance vanished. The listening post, never meant to hold under pressure, offered little protection once grenades detonated and movement closed in from multiple directions at once. Johnson was hit early. Shrapnel and bullets tore into his body as the raiders rushed the position, and pain arrived fast enough to register, but not fast enough to slow him. Training and instinct took over, which meant he kept his feet, raised his rifle, and fired at shapes moving through the darkness whenever they crossed into range. Visibility was poor, sound travelled unpredictably, and the night distorted everything. So Johnson adjusted by waiting until targets were unmistakable before pulling the trigger. Each shot came with intent, and each moment he stayed upright denied the attackers the quick collapse they needed. That changed when the rifle jammed. In most raids, a jammed weapon ended the fight immediately because it stripped the defender of both firepower and confidence. For Johnson, it triggered the opposite reaction. Instead of retreating or freezing, he stepped forward and swung the rifle itself, using weight and momentum to keep attackers from closing in cleanly. The engagement tightened further. When the rifle finally broke under repeated blows, Johnson dropped it without hesitation and reached for his knife because the fight had already moved beyond distance and into space measured by arm length. German soldiers attempted to rush him, expecting numbers to overwhelm resistance, but the confined terrain and darkness worked against them. Johnson stayed aggressive. Each movement denied the raiders room to surround him, and every step forward disrupted their coordination. The goal was no longer to defeat the attackers outright, it was to prevent them from taking control control of the post and seizing his wounded partner. Blood loss mounted quickly. Johnson had already taken multiple wounds, and later counts would list more than 20 separate injuries, but during the fight there was no time to assess damage. He compensated by maintaining momentum, because standing still meant being overtaken and slowing down meant surrendering the initiative entirely. At some point in the struggle, even the knife failed. The blade snapped under pressure, leaving Johnson with nothing but his hands and whatever space he could control in front of him. What followed was not clean or dramatic. It was chaotic, violent and exhausting, driven by proximity rather than precision. German soldiers began to hesitate. The raid had already lasted too long, and the listening post had not collapsed as expected. Each second increased the risk of counterfire from the trench behind Johnson, and uncertainty spread faster than commands in the darkness. This hesitation mattered. Raids depended on momentum, and momentum was gone. The attackers could not determine how many defenders remained, how close reinforcements might be, or how much longer resistance would hold. Johnson's refusal to disengage created the impression of escalation, even though he stood alone. That illusion proved decisive. The raiders began to pull back, not in panic but with urgency, recognizing that the conditions that favored them were slipping away. Grenades meant for the trench line were abandoned, wounded were left behind, and the objective of capture disappeared entirely. Withdrawal followed quickly. The Germans slipped back into the night, retreating across the same ground they had crossed minutes earlier, leaving behind a listening post that should have fallen almost immediately. Silence returned, heavy and uneasy, broken only by Johnson's laboured breathing and the sounds of movement fading into the distance. Johnson remained upright until he was certain the threat had passed. Only then did the weight of his injuries begin to settle in. His uniform was torn, his body soaked with blood, and exhaustion pressed in hard, but the post still belonged to the defenders. His wounded partner was alive, and the warning had been sent. When French soldiers reached the position later, the scene told its own story. They found a listening post torn apart by close-quarters combat, evidence of prolonged resistance where none should have existed, and a wounded soldier still conscious despite injuries that should have ended the fight much earlier. French officers understood immediately what that meant. Listening posts did not survive raids like this by accident. They survived only when someone refused to let the sequence unfold as planned. Johnson's endurance had not been passive. It had been active, aggressive and continuous. Evacuation followed, and with it documentation. Medical reports recorded the wounds carefully. Testimony reconstructed the sequence. The conclusion matched the physical evidence. A single soldier had absorbed the force of a raid meant to overwhelm him in seconds, and had broken it through persistence rather than strength alone. For Johnson, the fight did not feel extraordinary in the moment. It felt necessary. He would later struggle to describe every detail clearly because pain, shock and fatigue blurred the edges of memory. What remained sharp was the understanding that surrender was not an option once the fight began, and that holding ground meant keeping control until the attackers gave up trying. The darkness that swallowed the raiders also swallowed any sense of closure, but the effect of that night did not disappear with them. A German trench raid had failed completely, a listening post had held, and a wounded private had done what doctrine said should not be possible. When Henry Johnson was finally pulled back from the listening post, the violence of the night remained written across his body. Gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries and deep cuts left him barely able to stand, yet French medics treated him with a kind of seriousness reserved for men who had altered the course of a fight. They had seen listening posts erased for far less, and survival at that position told them something unusual had happened. French officers moved quickly to understand the engagement. Interviews were conducted while details were still fresh, terrain was examined, and the sequence of the raid was reconstructed piece by piece. The conclusion came without hesitation. A German trench raid had been stopped outright, no prisoners had been taken, the warning had been sent, and the sector had held. From a battlefield perspective, the outcome was clear. The French army recognised Johnson with the Croix de Guerre, a decoration awarded for acts of bravery under direct enemy fire. The citation described resistance against a superior force and the prevention of a successful raid, language used sparingly by an army that had spent years watching men die in similar positions. This recognition carried weight. By 1918, French commanders did not romanticize combat. They measured results, and Johnson's actions produced a result that mattered. A line that should have been compromised remained intact because one defender refused to yield. The American response unfolded very differently. Johnson returned to duty quietly, carrying French honours that his own army did not match. No immediate recommendation for America's highest awards followed. There was no public campaign, no official narrative built around the incident, and no effort to elevate the story beyond regimental memory. Segregation shaped that silence. The US Army of the First World War evaluated service through layers of hierarchy and bias, and black soldiers often found their actions minimized or overlooked entirely. Johnson's heroism did not fit comfortably within an institution that had already decided where men like him belonged. When the war ended in November 1918, the Harlem Hellfighters returned home to public celebration. Parades filled the streets, bands played, and crowds applauded a unit that had spent more time in continuous combat than nearly any other American regiment. Johnson marched with them, wounded, decorated by France, and largely unknown outside those who had served beside him. Civilian life offered little relief. The injuries Johnson carried never fully healed, and steady work proved difficult to maintain. Public attention faded quickly, replaced by the familiar realities black veterans faced after the war: limited opportunities, limited support, and a country eager to move on without fully accounting for the men it had sent forward. His story drifted to the margins. French records preserved the incident. Unit histories kept it alive. Fellow soldiers spoke of the night the raid failed, but nationally the recognition never came. Johnson died in 1929 at just 37 years old, his health worn down by war wounds and poverty, without seeing his actions formally honoured by the country he had defended. For decades that omission stood unchallenged. The evidence never disappeared, but it was rarely revisited. Only later, as historians re-examined First World War records with greater scrutiny, did the gap become impossible to ignore. The documentation was there, the accounts were consistent, the standard for America's highest decoration had been met. Pressure grew to correct the record. Military reviews compared Johnson's actions to established criteria, and the conclusion remained unchanged across evaluations. The night of May 14, 1918 met the threshold for the nation's highest recognition for valour. In 2015, nearly 100 years after the raid, Henry Johnson was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The award could not change his life, but it changed how history recorded it. What had once been a footnote became a documented example of valour under conditions where failure was expected. The correction did not add drama or exaggeration. It restored accuracy. Recognition came late, but the facts had not changed. A listening post held, a raid failed, and one wounded private stood where doctrine said no one should. Henry Johnson's place in history does not come from territory seized or numbers counted, because his action left neither a captured trench nor a line pushed forward on a map. What it left instead was proof, written into the mechanics of war itself, that refusal could matter even when everything else favoured collapse. The Western Front rewarded predictability. Trench systems, raids and countermeasures all depended on men behaving the way doctrine expected them to behave under pressure. Listening posts were meant to fall quickly, raids were meant to end fast, and isolated sentries were not meant to alter outcomes on their own. That structure functioned because, most of the time, it worked. Johnson broke that expectation. On May 14, 1918, he did not defeat a German raid by matching its discipline or outmanoeuvring it with planning. He defeated it by denying its rhythm. Surprise failed, momentum stalled, and fear flowed in the wrong direction, which meant the system collapsed from the inside rather than succeeding as designed. That outcome matters far beyond a single night. Johnson's resistance shows how much modern warfare depends on assumptions, not just firepower. Training prepares soldiers for patterns, and doctrine relies on those patterns repeating. When a defender refuses to behave as expected, even briefly, the entire structure becomes fragile. This is not romantic. Johnson did not act with clarity or distance. He acted while wounded, exhausted and isolated, because surrendering control meant losing everything that mattered in that moment. His endurance was not symbolic, it was practical, violent, and decisive in the narrow space where the raid lived or died. His story also exposes a second truth, one that unfolded after the gunfire stopped. Heroism does not guarantee recognition. Johnson's action met the standard for the highest American honour in 1918, and yet it took nearly a century for that reality to be acknowledged. The delay was not caused by missing evidence or unclear testimony. It was caused by the system deciding whose actions were worth elevating and whose were allowed to fade. That context does not weaken the story, it sharpens it. Johnson did not fight for medals, and he did not survive because recognition awaited him. He fought because the alternative was unacceptable, and because holding ground in that moment meant keeping control when everything pushed toward collapse. The correction of his record in 2015 did not add meaning to what he did. It restored accuracy. When historians examine the First World War without filtering heroism through comfort or convenience, Johnson's stand fits exactly where it belongs. A listening post held against doctrine, a raid failed against expectation, and one man disrupted a system designed to erase individuals. That is why his story endures. Not because it promises that one person can always change the course of a war, but because it proves that, under certain conditions, one person can stop something terrible from happening right in front of them. Henry Johnson did not reshape the First World War. He did something smaller, rarer, and harder to dismiss. He held the line when the line was supposed to disappear. If you value historically accurate stories of courage that were ignored, delayed, or erased, subscribe to WW1 HEROES. Every episode restores documented actions to their rightful place in history, without exaggeration and without forgetting.